Hello.
That'll give you some more room.
Thank you. Do I just hit play? Oh, up there. There?
Do you prefer it to be on your...
It's fine. All good. All right, thank you. All right, I think we'll get started. I've got a fair bit of ground I'd like us to cover here, so I want to get started roughly on time. In case you're unaware, we'll be talking about telling your story to magnify Christ, which is to say talking about writing, writers, being a Christian writer, and so on. And when they asked me to give this workshop, they sent along a whole list of things they wanted me to cover, and so that's roughly the outline of what we'll be doing, talking about how to be a distinctly Christian writer. I'm going to talk mostly about amateur writing, if you will, but also at the end talk a little bit about those who maybe are looking at more professional, not quite the right term, but writing for pay or even writing for a living. So but primarily we'll be talking about just how to grow as a writer, how to become a proficient writer, and so on. Our outline will be something like this. We'll talk about some benefits of writing. We'll talk about the call. Could God call some people to write? What would that look like in your life? Some tips on becoming a better writer, and then we'll talk about some of the tools that can help you become a better writer, and then we'll wrap up by, so what do you actually do with all this writing you've created? What are some ways you could put it out there for people's benefit? What are some of the ways you might be able to actually start earning some money or even making a living off writing? And then I want to leave a good bit of time at the end for Q&A, because I think there will probably be a number of questions you'll have along the way. My understanding is we've got an hour and 15 minutes. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. Good. So before I do any of that, let me just give you my background so you know who I am and why they might have asked me to do this. Way back in 2002, I registered a domain name and just began a personal website. My family had just moved down to the States. That's my parents, my siblings, and Aileen and I had stayed behind here in Canada, and I thought it would be a neat idea to start a website, Challies.com, family website, where we could just sort of get together as family and write updates on what was going on in our lives. 2002, none of these things that we take for granted today existed, like Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or anything else. Blogs were brand new to the scene, just a word we're beginning to hear. And blogs were social media. There was no other social media really apart from blogs. It was only later that all those other things, Twitter and all those things, got added to the scene. And so if we wanted to socially relate to one another, blogs were the way to do it. And so I didn't know I had started a blog when I did, but eventually heard the term and just started using it to describe what I was doing. So I was just writing family updates, really, was what it was meant for. Then my church began to go through a program you probably heard of called Purpose Driven Life. I had grown up in Dutch Reformed churches and had found myself now in this Baptist church. They were doing Purpose Driven Life, and I was just a little bit confused by what I was reading and just decided, well, maybe I could write about what we're going through in this and why there's some things here that I'm finding strange or uncomfortable compared to, my background of Heidelberg Catechism and all of that. So I decided to blog my way through the 40 days of the purpose-driven life, and I started posting that to my blog, and lo and behold, it turns out that pretty much every other church in North America was going through purpose-driven life at the same time, and other people are having these same questions, and other people started reading, and first, tens and hundreds and thousands of people were reading along as I was doing these updates and just reflecting on all of it. At the same time, I found myself, in this Baptist church, but still with this Reformed theology I had learned in my background, and so I started writing about that as well, Calvinist theology, these sorts of things. And again, at the same time, lots of other people are asking these same questions and sort of wondering about Reformed theology. And so before I knew it, I was part of that group. People started calling the New Calvinists or whatever we were called back then. But not only that, I'd somehow become one of its voices, one of the people who was writing about these things and thinking out loud and in public. And so in that way, this blog grew up and eventually started to be able to support me so I could set aside the job I was doing. I was in the computer field at the time. I could set aside that and focus on writing instead. And then because I already had people who would read my writing, it was no big deal or no great surprise for publishers to approach and say, hey, would you like to write books? And it sort of grew out like that very organically. In 2003, I made the commitment, November 1st, 2003, made the commitment I try to write something every day for a year and just sort of stuck with that. So next week, I guess, it'll be 20 years of just every day having something new at the blog, which probably tells you something about my personality. At this point, I've written, so thousands of articles, quite a number of books, etc. And so I'm assuming that's why they asked me to come. Also, I live 12 minutes away, so not a big deal. But I've been writing vocationally for about 10 years now within the Christian field. So that's my background, and I'm assuming my credentials. So let's dive into these topics, and we'll talk about these different things, starting with the benefits of writing. 6 of them I'm going to give you. So if you're thinking about writing, you're interested in writing, and you're thinking, should I commit myself to writing, or should I develop the discipline, or start carving out the time in life, here are some benefits that might be yours. The first one is that writing puts your gifts and your talents to use. As you know, I'm sure God distributes different gifts and talents to different people. And he does so, of course, with the expectation that we'll identify those things and use them. We'll use them for the good of others and for the glory of God. To distinguish between them, I see a talent as just, some natural skill that you just seem to have by way of birth, by way of personality, yet something you need to foster through practice in life. And I would say a gift is a spiritual gift you're given by the Lord as a Christian, specifically given to serve other people, but that also needs to be fostered through discipline and through practice. And in my understanding, the best writing seems to come from those who have developed their talent, but then also fostered the gift, especially the gift of teaching. And so you're using your talent in writing, your gift of teaching, and together you're writing in ways that hopefully benefit other people. How can you know if you've got that talent? How can you know if you've got that gifting if you don't give it a shot, right? And I think a lot of people wonder, and the way to answer the question is to do it, to develop the discipline, just give it a try and see what happens. And you probably know that's true with a lot of spiritual gifts, right? You may think you're gifted in some way, and you go out and you try, and you find out, yeah, the Lord really seems to have gifted me this way, or the Lord really seems to have not gifted me that way, and that's totally fine. But that's how we develop these things. So I'd say if you're wondering, do you have that talent, do you have that giftedness, then just try it. You might find you've got some unexpected skill or some unexpected passion, and often we find God doesn't really bestow or affirm the gift until we're using it, right? God doesn't necessarily gift us in ways that we expect, in ways that we would think would be naturally suited to us. And so writing puts your gifts and your talents to use. Second, writing helps you think. In all of life, we're called to bring order from chaos. And so this is true of humanity when God gave the creation mandate, right? He put man in this garden, and man's task was to push out the garden until it spread across the whole earth, to bring the orderliness of the garden to the rest of creation. It's true of the Great Commission, right? We go out into the chaotic mass of humanity and bring them this message of the gospel, of submitting to God and living well according to his purposes. It's true of sanctification, right? We come to Christ and we realize our lives are chaotic and disordered, but as we submit to the Lord and grow in his way, we become orderly. And it's true of our minds as well. Your mind is chaotic, your mind is disorderly, and there's ways that we're meant to bring order to it. And writing has the great benefit of helping bring order to your thoughts, can help you bring them to a logical, true, orderly form. I think I speak for a lot of writers when I say I don't really know what I think until I've written about it. It's through writing that I do my best thinking, because I'm recording those things and going back to them and sharpening them and just coming to truer and clearer convictions. William Zinsser says, he's done a lot of writing about writing. He says, clear thinking becomes clear writing. One can't exist without the other. So you write to clarify your thinking. The better your writing gets, the better your thinking will be. And the two really work hand in hand. So if you want to think better, you can write. If you want to write better, you can think. And these two kind of cascade. So hopefully you're becoming more and more orderly in your mind. Third benefit of writing is that it can give you influence. At least it can if you share publicly what you've written. That can be dangerous, of course, because not everyone can serve as a good influence. Evil people use writing, they use words to influence other people in evil ways. But so do a lot of people who mean to honor God, and I think most Christians can attest. There's certain books, certain people use their giftedness. They wrote a book or they wrote articles or something, and those really helped me. They brought a lot of benefit to me. So people were gifted, people used that influence, and it influenced me and made me a better Christian. If you're a pastor or church leader, I expect you've already been identified as somebody who's worthy of a leadership position, therefore worthy of influence within the local church or within the wider church. And that hopefully means that you match the biblical criteria of being above reproach, somebody who's worthy of imitation, somebody who's worthy of having influence over other people. And then you can gain influence, you can extend that influence to other people through writing, which can seem like something that's really arrogant to say, I would like to have influence over other people. And yet if God has gifted you and God has called you, then why wouldn't you use that influence? I think God calls us to influence others. Fourth, writing promotes humility. At least it should. When you set out to write, you'll probably very quickly find you're not nearly as good a writer as you thought you were. You also realize it's a whole lot harder than it looks. And it's like anything. People who are naturals at it, or people who put a lot of effort into it, a lot of practice, they make it look so easy. And then you set out to do it, and you find that it's actually very, very hard, which hopefully is humbling. That's even more true if you're working with an editor or someone and you send it to them and they return it, and there's a whole lot more of that red ink than you thought there would be. And so as you write, you'll realize just how little insight you have into yourself, how little insight you have into your own words, your own ability to communicate. You'll find, you were convinced something was absolutely logical, but now somebody expresses how it's illogical, or you thought it was absolutely perfect, but it's actually riddled with errors. I had an editor get in touch with me once, and so I'd written a book, and she had edited it, and very quickly there's those people who read it and right away email you to say, oh, there's a typo here and there. And she says in all her career in editing, she's never yet had a perfect book. Never once has I got every word spelled correctly and every comma, every period. It's impossible. None of us are as good as we think. And so humility has a way of promoting, writing has a way of promoting humility, which may not be a sufficient reason to write, but it's a good side effect of it. Fifth, writing helps you grow in godliness. None of us is as godly as we wish we were, or as we would like to be. All of us long to be godlier than we are. And in its own way, writing does promote godliness. It does this by engaging your gifts and engaging your talents, helping you think, fostering humility, but also by prompting you to go deeper and deeper into truth. And so I often find when I meet a new writer, they're going to cover the same few topics that everybody else covers as a new writer, and they're going to do so in a fairly trite way. But, they might write about sorrow and suffering or something, and they'll write pretty much the same article that everyone else has written. But as they write about it again and again, they'll get deeper and deeper, and they'll start to create new insights, or they'll find insights out of their own life or the lives of people they've met. And in that way, you're promoting godliness, right? You're diving deeper and deeper into the truth and finding better, clearer, more substantial, more edifying ways of expressing all that truth. And I can say personally that I don't think there's any discipline that's been more important to me than writing when it comes to growing in godliness. You know, I read, I pray, of course I do, but then the meditation where those things really go down deep into my heart and into my life, that's really through writing. Writing is my meditation on the whole. And like I said, I don't know what I believe, I don't know what I think until I've written it and chewed it over. And then the other thing is, if you're writing for an audience, you have to keep pushing yourself. Like a pastor, you know, you got to keep pushing yourself to grow in godliness so you're not being lapped by all the people you're leading. And the same is true as a writer. If you want to be able to help people and benefit them and influence them well, you got to keep growing in godliness, growing in your knowledge, growing in your ability to express these things so you have something to give to those who are reading. Then finally, writing is pleasurable, or it can be. You know, in the movie Chariots of Fire, they put this great line in that Eric Liddell never actually said, but we all wish he had said, which is that when he runs, he feels God's pleasure, right? So good. Not true, but it's so good. And, you know, I think most runners, really committed runners, can say they feel that pleasure as they run. But I think it takes time, right? Not many people feel that right away. You have to practice and grow as a runner before it becomes pleasurable. And a lot of writers can attest the same, that when they're really enjoying writing, you know, they get in that, what they call the state of flow, you know, where you're just, your mind shuts, it just completely focuses, and the outside world sort of fades away, and you're just head down writing. There can be such joy and such pleasure that comes in those moments. And that's where writing really transforms from the slog to this joy. And yeah, I think a lot of writers can attest they feel that joy as they write, as they grow in writing, as they become better writers, and so on. It really does become a source of pleasure rather than the hard slog it can always be, but especially I think when you're starting out and you're just learning how to express yourself, learning how to use your tools, learning how to embrace all these things. So, there are some benefits to writing. These have been true in my own life. I think things I've really enjoyed over the years. I do want to be clear that writing isn't necessary to the Christian life. It's not the only way to grow in any of these things. There's lots of ways of putting your gifts and talents to use. Lots of people think differently. They don't need to write in order to think. Lots of other ways of experiencing, you know, spiritual pleasure and growing in godliness and all of these things. But I can attest that for me and for many other writers, these really are some great benefits and ways of really experiencing the joy that comes as we're honoring the Lord in the way He's given us talents and the way He's gifted us and then called us to be an influence over other people. Okay, so I was asked to speak specifically on this, which is the call to write. Different people have different understandings of calling. You know, would God call somebody to write? I tend to put more emphasis when it comes to any sort of calling on the external call than the internal call. You know, how are people around you affirming you? What are they telling you to do and guiding you? But I know a lot of people who are convinced that God has called them to, let's say, pastoral ministry, especially preaching ministry. And, you know, if you're an elder in a church, you've had these people come to you and say, God has called me to be a preacher. And then I hear them preach or I hear them speak, and I think, I don't know that you're actually, I don't know that you're really hearing the voice of the Lord calling you to do that. And that's okay. Not everyone is called to be a preacher. I see people, you know, they think they're meant to be a pastor, but when they lead, nobody follows. And that's just a good way of looking at people and saying, who are the people that God seems to be calling, seems to be leading into these positions? There's a great ministry, by the way, in telling people, no, I don't think you're called. And, you know, I'm not going to affirm that gift in your life. We don't have to say just because someone feels that calling that it's a true calling. They need people outside of themselves who can say, no, I don't think so. There might be other ways you can serve. If that's true of preachers, it's definitely true of writers as well. A lot of people feel they're called to be writers. And yet, often I think the evidence doesn't really bear that out. I had someone get in touch with me last week, no joke, who told me he had written the second most important book after the Bible. You can probably guess what it was about. It was about the book of Revelation and something to do with Russia and Ukraine. I'm not entirely sure. But, I had to, of course, look it up on Amazon and just sort of see what it was like. And, it was written at about a sixth grade level, and it was just terrible, terrible writing, terrible book, terrible analysis, terrible in every way. Terrible cover, of course, too. So, and look, that's just reality. So I don't feel like I need a word from the Lord to say, I don't think you're called to be a writer, and I don't think this is the second most important book after the Bible. But a lot of people feel they're called to do lots of things, but it can be clear to most other people that they're not. Because a call usually comes with opportunity and with ability. If God is really calling us to something, if it's truly God's calling, I think He'll equip us to do it well. We'll still need to grow, we'll still need to work, but there will still be some baseline of skill that God gives us and some baseline of affirmation as well, where other people can say, yes, I've really benefited from you as you do that thing. So how can you know if you're called to write? Well, I'd say the first way is you're called to write because you're actually doing it. You're actually doing the hard work of writing. And hopefully people are benefiting from it. I can't even tell you how many people get in touch and say, I started a blog and I would, like you to tell other people about it. That's what I do. I tell people about other people's writing. I love to do that. But a lot of people, they'll start a blog and they'll write 5 or 6 articles in pretty short order. And then they'll send me the address to their blog and say, can you follow it? And then, start telling other people about it. And then, they go to writing once a week and once a month and once a year, and they peter out. And that's absolutely fine, because most people have 5 or 6 article ideas and they write them all, and then they just, kind of run out of ideas and stop. They've tried something, it didn't work out, and that's completely fine. But probably the people who are really called to write are the ones who are going to grind it out, right? They're going to stick it out, especially in those hard days where you're putting a lot of effort in and it's not being rewarded financially or with people giving you affirmation, people reading it, and so on. But yeah, it's great to try things, and if it doesn't work out, that doesn't make you less of a person. That's great. You try something else, and you'll find your calling. But I think the people who are really called to whatever calling, whether it's writing or preaching or evangelism, they're gonna grind it out even when the results aren't there, because they'll have that sense that this is what the Lord wants them to do, the way He wants them to express their giftedness. Then the second way to know if you're called to write is to solicit feedback, to see what people are saying about your writing. So you'll need people to read it and tell you whether it's informing them, whether it's helping them, whether it's blessing them, whether it's just really, really confusing them, those sorts of things. One of the criteria my church uses when somebody's learning to preach is, after the sermon, was the text more clear to you than it was before the sermon? And sometimes, honestly, the answer is no. He made it less clear. He made it more opaque as he preached. And again, that's fine. It just means if that's borne out over time, he probably just isn't gifted to preach. Fine. Just means fine, move on, try something else where you eventually discover your giftedness. And the same can be true of writers, right? The more you write, the less clear things become, or the more you write, the more people get confused about what you're saying or what you're writing. So I think any kind of call comes with outside affirmation. Our feelings about our call are really unreliable. So I'd say if you feel like maybe the Lord wants you to write, or the Lord's gifted you to write, you think He could be a blessing to other people through your writing, then write. Commit yourself to the discipline of writing and get feedback from people who will read it. You might have to ask people specifically, can you read these things? Or it might just be comments on Facebook or something, but get that feedback and look for the affirmation that comes from other people. That's more reliable than your own sense there. So there's no biblical office of writer, that's not a thing we find in the Bible, but God does call us to tasks or vocations or callings, whatever, ways we can deploy our gifts and our talents, and in ways that serve His people, bring glory to His name. And I'm really convinced that God does that for writers. He gives them that desire to write. He gives them the talent. He gives them the gifting. He gives them the just the desire to keep grinding it out to become better writers and then to serve his people in that way. And so to find out if that's you, first work at seeing if you can write and if you will write, if you'll just maintain the discipline, and then gain feedback by people who love you enough to say, probably not, and that's completely fine. I want to talk about becoming a better writer. Everybody can write at a certain baseline, of course, but if you want to really grow in your writing, here are some ways I might recommend you do that. Probably if you're called to be a writer and if you're really going to commit yourself to that, there's probably some natural talent there, right? I would hope. But probably you're also going to have to just put in lots of practice. There's not much that comes easy to any of us in life, and that's great. God rewards that practice, that grinding it out. But I think anyone can become a capable writer, so you can express yourself clearly and bless people through your writing if you'll just devote yourself to the commitment. So to do that, here are a few tips I've gleaned along the way. This is probably for me the most important one is find the right time. Learn the time of day, certainly, and maybe the time of week, especially if you're in a certain pattern. Preachers, probably Monday morning, you're not going to be at your mentally sharpest time. But find the time of day when you're at your mental peak and try to do your writing then. So you have to know yourself a little, but you probably know there's some times in the day when your mind is sharp and sometimes in the day when your mind is dull. You've got high energy sometimes, high creative energy, and low creative energy other times. Sometimes where it's easy to be creative, sometimes where it's very hard to be creative. For most people, they're at their creative peak in the morning, sometime between, the second cup of coffee and lunch. Somewhere in that time is when your mind is just really working, really firing. There's a few weirdos who, it's in the middle of the night, it's, 10 or midnight, that's where they really come alive. But for the majority of people, it tends to be in the morning. But if you want to be a writer and, a skilled writer, it's important as much as you can to find the time of day when you're at your creative peak. And you'll probably find what I find, that I can do way more between 8 a.m. than 10 a.m. than the rest of the day put together. It's just everything's working then, my brain is sharp, and I can just write flat out. By the time 10, 11, noon comes along, my brain is tired, my creative energy is gone. And so I do, I focus on administration or other things that time of day. But as much as you can, however life cooperates, and for some people it doesn't, but being able to find those creative peak times and use those for your writing, you'll probably find a whole lot more freedom in your writing that way. Second is to find the right place. So find the right time, also find the right place. Some people just absolutely thrive in a quiet office, door locked, etc., music on. Some people need to be around people or in a coffee shop or something. Either one's fine. You just got to learn yourself, learn what works best for you. Or some people like to start quiet, in the morning and then go to a cafe in the afternoon or something, and they might find that rejuvenates them a little bit. For me, I sometimes find just changing chairs or using a standing desk or something, that's as good as changing locations. It gives me another little burst of energy. But right time, right place. If you can get those two things down, and again, if life cooperates, I understand that it's not possible for everyone, but if you can get those two things in order, I think you'll find right there that's a big boon to your writing. Third, just write. Writers are amazing at making excuses. We're the absolute best at it. Excuses not to write right now. I'm too tired, too busy, too distracted, haven't had enough coffee, tomorrow will be better, all these things. We can find any number of reasons not to write right now. But singers sing and runners run and painters paint and writers write. That's what writers do. So you've got to actually write. Some days it's going to be the easiest, the most joyful thing in the world. Some days it's going to be really, really hard, and you're just going to have to sit down and force yourself to do it. But it's important to push through that friction sometimes, most of which just comes from inside. You just don't want to. But often you find once you sit down and you commit yourself to it and you push through, you'll find you may make a whole lot more progress than you thought. Fourth is to practice, of course. It takes a lot of practice to become a capable writer. It takes even more practice to be an exceptional writer. And I don't think there are a lot of shortcuts. So what I would recommend is just setting a goal for yourself, a certain number of words per day, a certain number of articles per month, or whatever it is. Set a goal for yourself and just work toward that goal. Commit yourself to it. That's why I, way back when, decided I was going to post an article a day for a year. It just made sense. I was giving up way too often, and the periods between posting articles are growing longer and longer. So I thought, I'm going to do it every day for a year, or I'm just going to quit because I'm just getting frustrated. And so that was my way of disciplining myself. I don't necessarily recommend that, to be clear, but just setting some sort of a goal and pushing yourself to meet it. And then probably the best topic to write about is whatever's on your mind. Just whatever you're thinking about, whatever you last thought about, whatever you last read in a book, just write about it. And just get that out, find some way of analyzing it, and just write. And then realize you'll never write anything you're completely happy with, because we live on, somewhere squeezed between Genesis chapter 3 and Revelation 22, where everything's messy, and it's hard to write. It's hard to write something you're really satisfied with. Writing is subjective. It'll never, you can solve a math equation. You can't solve an article. You can't solve a book. You'll always just be like preaching a sermon. It's going to be good enough, and I'm going to submit it, hand it in, and that's fine. So don't wait for perfection. It'll never come. Fifth is persevere. Writing can be really discouraging. But I think a lot of people give up too quickly because they're not getting the feedback they want. They've written 10 articles, and Christianity Today hasn't come calling yet, and so they just sort of walk away. And I understand it's hard, but you need to commit for a long term, not just write once or twice and hope you've changed the world or changed somebody's life, but just really grind it out. And that's been one thing I've been working on for years now. Is I don't really care if somebody reads one article on my site. I mean, that's fine if they do that, but I want people to read over a longer period of time, read a bunch of articles, and I'm hoping over time, if they'll stick with me a little bit, they'll gain some benefit. But I can't. It's very hard to change somebody's life in one sermon or one article or one book. You need time. And so you want people to commit to reading your writing, and you'll disciple them through the written word. And over time, if you persevere and they persevere, that's where you'll see the benefit. Number 6 is get critical feedback. We already covered that, but one way of doing that is to start a writers group where you just get together once a week or once a month, and you just submit your writing to one another, read it in advance, come and bring positive, negative feedback. If you start one in your church, there's probably other people who would join it. Everyone's just waiting for someone else to do it. When I started one in my church, we immediately had 6 or 8 people who were interested and engaged, and we were just sharing writing, and it was really a sweet time together. You can hire writing coaches. You can, again, ask friends or family members to give you feedback and so on. Or you can just release it to the wild and see what people say on Facebook, and that's fine too. Number 7 is read good writers, and read a lot. I don't necessarily recommend reading a lot of books about writing. You can read a couple, but I think the better benefit comes when you just read books by really talented authors. So find some authors whose works just really, really resonate with you, and you think, when I grow up, I want to be like that writer. Read their books again and again. Just read them until their words or the way they construct sentences, or it starts to flow out of you. I think the number one book I've read that's made me an author is the ESV. I read it and listen to it basically every day. And as I read my own writing, I hear the cadence of the ESV now, which is why you should read the ESV and not the NIV or something. The ESV is beautifully written. They put a high emphasis on really good use of the English language. The NIV put much more emphasis on teaching you what the words mean, but it doesn't flow nearly as nicely. So if you can find a translation that sounds beautiful to the ear, There's probably no other book you're going to read as much, so therefore no other book that will influence you as much. I really think if you find a beautiful Bible translation, you'll start to hear the beauty of that language come out in your own writing. That's no knock on the NIV. It's just not a very well-written book compared to the ESV. It's clearer. They make clearer decisions on some of those verses, but it's not very well written. I've offended all the NIV crowd. Number 7 is use good tools, which is actually going to transition us to the next section. As you want to grow as a writer, I'd encourage you to identify what tools are available to writers and to make use of the best of those tools. Whatever job you're in, whatever you do in life, you're dependent on your tools, right? And it makes sense to me, at least, to make sure you're using the best tools that are available to you or that you can afford or whatever the case may be. So, you see it all the time on medical shows on TV. Some guy gets a Bic pen or something and jabs it through somebody's throat and saves their life. And, you can make do with that kind of thing, but you'd rather a surgeon use a scalpel or something, right? If you're going to the doctor and you're having an operation, you're hoping he's not going to Dollarama to buy his scalpels, right? You're hoping he's buying the absolute best stuff. We're dependent on our tools, and better tools tend to deliver better results. Writers often try and use really bad tools and expect it's going to deliver a really good result. It might, but chances are your success or your productivity as a writer will depend somewhat on identifying the best tools and making use of those tools in the way they're meant to be used. So I hope there's not Microsoft Word people here like there are NIV people here, but Microsoft Word is one of the worst pieces of writing software ever invented. Why is that? Because it's meant to do everything. You want to do one thing. You want to get thoughts out of your mind and onto the screen. Microsoft Word does mail merges, and it prints envelopes, and it designs newsletters. It's got 1,000 buttons up top. You don't need any of that stuff. You just need to get the words out of your mind and onto the screen. Google Docs, same thing. Apple Pages, maybe a little bit better. But using something like that to do the kind of writing an article, it's like using one of those little multi-tools. It has a screwdriver and a wrench and all those things in one tool. It's like repairing your car with that. You can do it if you want to. But why wouldn't you buy the proper tools and fix your car properly? So there's some better tools that can help you as a writer. There's this whole realm of writing applications now called minimalistic or distraction-free or something like that. They come under different names. The purpose of those apps is to remove almost all the friction you find in other apps and just help you get those words out of your mind, through your fingers, onto the screen. Most of them just give you a big blank page. They don't give you all sorts of formatting and fonts and colors and all of that. They just give you a blank screen that you're meant to type on. And that is super, super helpful when you're a writer. They let you do one thing, and they promote doing that one thing really well. Again, like tools. You buy a tool that does one thing, not that does 100 things. So I'd encourage you to look at those apps and just try them out. See if they're for you. My favorite is called Ulysses, like the name of the book, Ulysses. It's only available on Apple, so if you're in Microsoft world, you'd have to find something else. IA Writer is one that's similar, very good. It's on both Mac and Windows, I believe. Byword, another one. You can just Google minimalist writing apps or something, and you'll come up with a whole bunch of them. It's a hot field. There's lots of different ones available. But you'll know those apps because they show you a blank screen with just a few words on it, and the idea is you write, and all the other stuff just kind of disappears into the background. So you're not distracted by all the other things. You're not changing fonts and worrying about all that stuff. You're just getting the ideas out of your head and onto the screen. So for software, I'd really encourage you to try that or just find something else that works for you. But know that not all tools are equally good, and we are dependent on our tools. We don't need to pretend it's otherwise, that there's no tool that stands between us and writing. We use tools. So I'd say use the best ones if you can. And then there's hardware as well. not all computers, not all screens, not all keyboards are created equal. So I'm a devotee of mechanical keyboards rather than like a laptop keyboard. If I use a laptop keyboard, I'm feeling pain in about 2 minutes. If I use a mechanical keyboard, I can type for several hours before I feel pain because they're just made to promote more typing rather than less. They're just better for that sort of thing. I find it easier to type on a big screen than a small screen, a computer rather than an iPad, that kind of thing. So I can use all of those tools, but if I'm really trying to be the best writer I can be and trying to use my tools well, then I'm going to try and set up my writing environment to use the best tools and the best apps. Obviously, there's cost considerations, makes sense. None of us can have all the tools we want to have. But there's a world of difference between a good computer on a good desk with your butt on a comfortable chair, all of that, versus a tablet that's on a table that's too high and your seat's too low and your rear end is aching and you're typing on a keyboard, your fingers are on fire. If you can construct a writing environment that helps you and fosters long-term instead of short-term, etc., I think you'll find that really beneficial. But the main thing, think about the fact that you're using tools. Not all tools are equal. Some tools do their job better than other tools. And if you really want to grow as a writer, you should consider the tools you use and whether they're really promoting good writing. And then over time, as you grow as a writer, you can probably find reason to justify buying better tools and more expensive ones and so on. One more thing about tools is a lot of us have gotten into this mindset that apps should be free. That if it's on the App Store, I should be able to get it for free, and I don't want to pay 99 cents for that app. Honestly, I'll labor over a 99-cent app way longer than I'll labor over something that's far more expensive. There's something about apps that get me, but the labor is worthy of its hire. You usually find that something you're paying for offers you more features, more value than something that's free. And so if you're willing to pay for something, even app costs tend to be minimalist. If you're writing seriously and you're paying $30 a year for an app, I think you can probably justify it. But look at getting premium apps, not free ones. So again, think about your tools. As a writer, you're depending upon these tools. You'll probably find you do a little bit better with better tools rather than worse ones. Right, one more heading, which is what to do with your writing. I'm not going to have time to go deep into this, and there's a lot of different pathways to figure out what to do with your writing, but I'll give you a couple thoughts under the heading of amateur and professional. Again, not quite the right categories, but we'll use them. I'll define an amateur writer as somebody who writes on a part-time basis and who's content to either not make money from their writing or just, make kind of pocket money or occasional money, that sort of thing. So what can you do with your writing if you're content to do it that way? Well, I think blogs are still a really good option for that. I think blogs were about a day old when somebody started saying, that's it, blogs are done, nobody's going to use them anymore. People have been prognosticating their demise since they started. But I think they do fine, at least for people who stuck with them. And what happened was everybody got a blog when they first came out, and then about 90% of the people quit, which was fine. They found it wasn't for them. They just got on board like we all got on board with everything else, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, because everyone else was, but we found it wasn't for us. And so people rotated out, and that's fine. But a lot of people have stuck with it, and it still is a very viable form of media for those people. So I think it's still a good option if you want to just write and make your writing public. It's a very good way of doing it. And then, of course, once you write it, you send it out through Facebook or other places where people tend to get their curation, where they find their links. Another option is Substack, which is essentially a blog 10 years later or 15 years later, but the difference is it tends to be emailed to people rather than them having to find it. So Substack, you write it, you hit post, and it just emails out to everybody. They also build in the ability for people to pay for your writing if you want. They can subscribe, and you might find some people are willing to pay a little bit to read your newsletters. But those are two really good options for people who are interested in creating this writing and then putting it out there for the public, hoping to be able to serve people or influence people. There's another form, short form writing. I think mostly women do this, but on Instagram, where you just keep things pretty short. My sister's the master of this. She has this whole big Instagram writing ministry, and it works really well. I don't know anything about it, but I've seen it really serve well, especially people who are very visual and want their writing to look beautiful, as she does. It's a neat way of doing it. But I think those are currently the main options for people who are, not looking to make a living off your writing, not wanting to do it vocationally, just wanting to serve people and make it public. So start a blog through WordPress or something, or start your newsletter through Substack or something along those lines. And if you want more tips, just jump on my website and search for blog tips or starting a blog or something. You'll find I've written about it several times. That would sort of help you get started with some more specific tips. I will talk a little bit about writing professionally because I often get asked about this. So, if you want to create either a substantial income rather than a very minimal one, or even to be able to earn a living off writing, let's talk about that. Essentially, you'd begin in the same way, which is you would begin by, starting a blog or starting a newsletter or something. It's almost impossible to find anyone who will be interested in you as a writer unless you can bring an audience with you. That's something that's changed over the last few years. It used to be that publishers would try to identify good writers, and they would bring those writers to their audience. So, Crossway would have their group of people, and Zondervan would have their group of people, these Christian publishers, and they'd bring writers on, say, you're our kind of writer, we're now going to introduce you to our audience. Those days are done. What happens now is you're expected to bring an audience to the publisher and say, if you publish my book, here's what I can offer you. Here are the people who will read it. One of the strange consequences of that is that it's way easier to be a terrible writer who has an audience than a good writer who doesn't. It's unfortunate, but if you're a popular person, you're a megachurch pastor or something, you'll never have trouble getting a writing contract, even if you're a terrible writer. But if you're an exceptional writer, but you don't have an audience, you're almost guaranteed not to get any contracts to write. It's kind of sad, but that's where the writing world is at right now. So if you want to kind of make that step to being a professional writer, you'll have to be able to gain some sort of a readership, almost definitely. Which means you need to begin writing somewhere and finding people who will read your writing. And eventually you'll hit this kind of critical mass where you have enough people that now you can start to monetize it in some way. So people might pay for your newsletter, or people might be willing to give you donations, or you might get asked to speak at some conferences or other things. And now you're getting some, minimal income going. And then as you keep building it up, eventually you might hit that point where you can say, yeah, I can do this vocationally. Probably what you need to do is focus on a whole bunch of different income streams and eventually hope that together they add up to a living. So when people find out I'm a blogger, usually I see them go pensive for a minute, and then they ask, how do you make a living at that? So I'll tell you, all these things that I've talked about, I have to bring money in all these different ways in order to be able to support myself and my family. So Patreon, people can sign up for patronage, that old model of people who would support writers and others. Affiliate programs, so directing people to Amazon or other bookstores can provide some minimal income, speaking at conferences, writing books. All of those things together can eventually, between them, add up to a living wage, at least at times. For what it's worth, and sorry to shatter your dreams, there's almost no Christian authors who can make a living just writing books. It's the average Christian book sells about 10,000 copies. You can count on making about $1, maybe $2 per copy sold. You can write maybe one book a year, most people, and even then the publishers don't really like that pace. So you do the math, and it's very, very hard to just be an author who writes books and brings in money. Maybe if you're selling like David Platt numbers of books or something, one of those rare people who just really, he gives all the money away, of course, but one of those people who's really selling that volume of books, then maybe you could do it, but almost nobody can. I certainly could not. It's just the money's not there in Christian books for the great majority of writers. So again, you need to be realistic and just think about, okay, my path to professional writing might be something like this. I'm going to start to gain an audience through blogging or some kind of a newsletter. Hopefully, eventually, enough people will read it that it starts to gain some traction, and maybe then Desiring God or Gospel Coalition or something is interested in accepting an article from me, and I can serve people that way, and I can start to get in some donations, or advertisers might show some interest and all of that. And then maybe a conference comes calling and I can speak at a conference, and they might sell, direct more people to my site or something. And eventually, then maybe at that point, an agent would be interested in talking to you, a literary agent, which is what you need in order to talk to a publisher. It's just a slow build of starting with just seeing, will people read my writing? So that's the path to being a quote-unquote professional. If you do hit the pinnacle and actually publish a book, that's where the disappointment sets in, because you realize it. I can't earn a living at this, so I'm right back to where I began. I just got to keep, growing the readers and the newsletter and other things. So yeah, I want to go to Q&A because I think people have questions about all of this, but I do want to say this. The topic in all of this has been magnifying Christ with our writing, and the big battle is always how not to magnify me in my writing, and that's always what we're doing. There's nothing wrong. If your writing is good, there's nothing wrong with telling people, I've written this, and sending it out for people to read. In fact, it can be more prideful to hold it back than to release it to the public, right? If God has gifted us and we're trying to use our gifts, there's nothing wrong with saying, here, I'm offering this to the world in the hope that it'll benefit some people. You have to get over yourself in that way, in that kind of faux humility. On the other hand, man, there are so many people out there who really just want to be noticed. They want to be recognized. They just want the acclaim they think will come. So yeah, I think again and again we need to just pause to ask, does this article, or does this book, or does this strategy, is it really meant to serve me, or is it meant to serve other people? There's so many opportunities that come along eventually, where you can see people just want to promote themselves, or I'm offered the opportunity, to promote myself, or make money in a way that would really just be self-promotion rather than be serving other people. So I think constantly asking the question, is this about me, or is this about serving other people? And I think if you're just constantly looking outside yourself, I want to love people, I want to serve the Lord, and say no to lots of good things, lots of opportunities, if they seem too self-directed or too prideful or something, and just keep directing people toward the Lord. Keep doing your utmost to serve Him with your gifts and talents. Then I think you won't go too far wrong. And you even can, in a sense, promote yourself, promote your writing, but in a way that's, your real concern is not for yourself. Your real concern is for the other person. I wouldn't want to go hear a preacher who thought he had nothing to say. I wouldn't want to, sit under the ministry of a preacher who showed up every week and said, I'm useless, I got nothing for you. Tell me what you're preaching and be excited about it, and, believe that you can serve other people with your preaching. That's what we're doing. And so, yeah. Am I magnifying Christ? Is my deep desire here to magnify Christ through my writing? Is all of this, what seems like self-promotion or strategizing, all of this really directed toward serving the Lord? If you can answer that yes in your own heart, maybe some other people are affirming that, I think you can't go too far wrong. So I'll end there because I expect there's a good number of questions. And yeah, let's have them. Yes, sir. No. Right. Yeah, so the field has changed a little bit since whenever my very first book came out. But that came out of just, blogs were so new, they were very much seen as the minor leagues back then. And so publishers were watching the blogs and kind of picking up on people who they saw, this person will be read, he has readers, and so will it's not a big deal to get a book contract. There's a few publishers out there who will work with authors who don't have agents, but most publishers do want you to have an agent because it just helps them sort through the manuscripts. They get so many of them. When they work with agents, they know they've already been vetted, and hopefully they're only getting the best of them. And agents know which authors are likely to suit which publishers. And so they're not going to send, an academic treatise on the Psalms to, 10 of those publishing or something. It's just not their field. They're not going to do it. But they would talk to an IVP or, a Zondervan academic or something like that. So they just know the field. And so I think most publishers are pretty eager to work with agents now, and some of the bigger ones won't talk to publishers unless they have, or won't talk to authors unless they have an agent. And agents are pretty hard to come by. The rule of thumb is if an agent wants money out of you, probably he's not a good agent. If he wants a percentage of anything the publisher pays you, that's probably a good agent. So they're willing to take the risk and then then they're very incentivized to get your book as good as it can be, get it with the right publisher, and then they'll only take money as it comes in from the publishers. It can work the other way, but that's generally it. Yeah.
What's your opinion on self-publishing, like on Amazon?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So self-publishing has also changed a ton over the last few years. It's so much easier now than it used to be. Because Amazon and other printers, you can literally just submit something to them and it'll be a printed book available on Amazon in no time flat. I'm in favor of it, but you've got to make sure it's been properly edited. And that's the hard thing, to find somebody other than yourself who can read it, somebody really talented as an editor who can read it and vet it for you. Because none of us is good enough to do our own writing and editing. We don't understand our own weaknesses. We can't catch our own typos and so on. So I think, I think they can be very helpful. I don't think they're likely to lead to an actual publisher, though. I mean, that was the story of The Shack, right? And everybody got excited about self-published book, that The Shack was self-published and then got picked up by a publisher and sold, 20 or 30 million copies or something. And there's been some secular mainstream versions of that as well. That's very, very rare, though. So I think if you're self-publishing a book, you're not counting on it gaining the attention of publishers. You're doing it because maybe a publisher isn't interested or it's just not a good fit for a publisher. I've self-published in the past or something close to it just because I wanted to get the books out really quick. And I just submitted a book 2 days ago for Zondervan, and it will come out in about a year from now, and that's quick with publisher timelines. Usually you're looking at about a year and a half from the time you hand it over to the time it's actually in your hands. And if you're writing something that's urgent, that can be way too long. Unless you're John Piper. His books are in and edited and out again in about 3 months. Other questions? Great.
So I'm shifting from being a copy and content writer to like inspirational writing. How long would you say it takes to make that shift? Because it's a different mindset.
Yeah, the shift from being a copywriter to being a more devotional writer or something. Yeah, I think it just depends on your talent as a writer. Really, they are very, very different disciplines. And I'm very thankful for copywriters. I've been amazed at my inability to write back copy for my own books. I can't do that. But you hand it off to the team at the publisher, and it's amazing how they can synthesize. But they are very different fields. So I don't know that I could put a timeline on it. I think it's just a commitment to sort of exploring both both sides of that equation, because they are so very different. I think if I wanted to make that transition, I would spend a lot of time reading really good writers who just really evoke that sense in me of I want to be like that person. And I'm not at all above, especially with older writers, I'm not at all above taking their ideas and just making them my own. I'll make a note that I've done that. But I think it can be great sometimes to find some older writer or old illustration you found in a book somewhere and just write it as if it's your own. Then at the bottom, just write something like, I plagiarized this from whoever. Totally fine. It's, a lot of the writing we do on blogs and stuff, it's not formal writing, and I think we can adapt to the medium. So blogs and footnotes don't really get along very well together, and that's okay. Like academic writing on a blog is a little bit of a mismatch, I think, a medium mismatch. So I think it's okay to be more low key with citing sources and everything. It's fine, just put a note at the bottom and say, I pilfered this idea from this old author or from this other person. It's not academic. You're not getting paid for it, etc. It's fine. So it can be a great discipline is to rewrite what other people have written as a form of practice. Yeah.
You mentioned people who have a lot of clout but are not great writers.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you pick up a book or you read an article, how do you know this is quality?
This is quality? Yeah. So here's the secret. When you see an author's name and then below it says with and then another person's name much smaller, almost always that means this guy has written it based on the ideas or sermons or something of this guy. And that's fine. I mean, it's accepted within the field, but that's usually how it goes. The small name is the one who's done most of the work. And guys like Jared Wilson used to do a lot of that, right? It would be Matt Chandler with Jared Wilson, and Matt would preach some sermons or something, but Jared would turn it into a book, and that's great. That happens a lot in the field, especially with some of the bigger name preachers. It would be rare for a lot of those people to be writing their own books. In terms of quality, I don't know. I think you just know good writing when you read it, and usually because that does something within you. It's not just ideas, but it's hitting your heart as well. Yeah, and then there's just a fluency some people have with the written word. You can just see they can, when you see a magician and he just handles playing cards and he does things with those cards you can't imagine. He's put so much practice into it. It looks so deft, and it took so long for him to learn to do those tricks, but it looks so natural now. I think with a good writer, you see that as well. He's practiced and practiced and practiced, so those things just look easy, they're smooth, they're natural. He's using good illustrations. He's got a good mastery of the English language. Those are the people I love to read, and they're fairly rare. There's a lot of pretty poor quality writing in the Christian world. They're just very average quality writing. But I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that it's easier to be a writer if you have an audience but little talent versus no audience but phenomenal talent.
Can you just give us some examples of people that are like, man, I really enjoy this writer that are generally producing great content?
Yeah, so Jared Wilson, if you're looking for books, he's a very good writer. Really, I think exceptionally talented. Hannah Anderson, another very, very good writer. I think if you read R.C. Sproul's books, he wasn't the most creative writer, but he sure could synthesize ideas as almost nobody else. Jerry Bridges, another very talented writer. He and Sproul, of course, are enjoying heaven right now, but their books survived them. And one of the great joys of being a committed reader, by the way, is making friendships with people who are dead. But you get to know them, and the books are their pages, and they really do become your friends. You really learn to get to know them, and they've influenced you, and you almost can't wait to get to heaven and just say, man, thank you. I'm glad to finally shake your hand. But I can't tell you, authors like J.R. Miller he was writing mostly in the late 1800s. He's influenced me more than anyone, I think, in this world. And I know so much about him, and he's influenced my writing, he's influenced my thinking, he's influenced my theology. Love him. Can't wait to meet him. And yeah.
Do you have any practices on having someone check the theology of what you're writing? Like anybody, like do you have trusted people that you just are like, this is a book before it goes out?
Yeah.
Or does your publisher do that?
For books, the publisher will do that, and sometimes the publisher will hire a theological reviewer, and so they hire, for a couple of my books, they've hired someone to read it in advance and give feedback. And I'm a Baptist. They hired a Presbyterian last time, which was a little weird. We had to discuss some of those things, but that was really helpful. On more the informal writing, if you're putting it on social media, trust me, you'll know in about 5 minutes. It'll be clear. But yeah, I think if you're concerned, I think it's a good idea. And if I'm writing about things that I'm concerned about nuance, or I feel like I'm maybe a little bit over my head, I'll bounce it off a friend or somebody else. Even bounce it off Aileen, who's not a theologian but has a good discerning mind and can say that's unclear, or if you say that, women are going to think you're an absolute jerk, so don't say it like that, those sorts of things. And so she can give it a screen as well. But yeah, I got a couple people I'll send it to if I'm concerned, and often it's helpful just to get the thumbs up. And you're like, okay, yep, yeah.
Do you have different approaches for when you're writing for like a book or a blog versus writing to speak or preach or teach that are helpful?
Yeah, there are different voices for books, blogs, and sermons, if you will, and it's important to develop those separately, I think. So, one of my practices when I'm writing a sermon is I write it out loud. So I'm speaking the words before I write them down. That means it's coming from my spoken voice rather than my written voice, and that's how I try and separate those. You notice, for example, that sentences are very different when spoken than when written. Ideas in writing tend to be, you have much more complex sentences, longer ideas, etc. Writing tends to be, or speaking tends to be terse, to the point, and so on. So yeah, I think that's one of the disciplines I found, because otherwise when I do public speaking, it sounds an awful lot like a blog post or a book. Books and blogs are, I think you can develop different voices or the same voice. Most of my earlier books were written in as books. Seasons of Sorrow, my more recent book, was written as blogs first. And so it was written more in that form, much shorter form, a little more urgent and informal as well. As time goes on, I've been trying to write with far more illustration as well, and less of the kind of didactic teaching, and more of just showing things, trying to give people pictures, word pictures, evoke feelings, and so on. And I've really been enjoying that as well. But we're never static as writers or preachers or anything else. So we're always changing, always evolving. That's part of the joy of it. Who I am now is definitely not who I was 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, I expect I will have, developed even more as a writer in different directions. Yeah.
So I'm an SIM missionary serving in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And so I'm working with a Muslim people group. Now, writing is a big importance in our work to update people, share the stories about God, how He's working. Now, we do have some safety concerns about what we can share,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, we do need to share. So, do you have experience with that, or recommendations on how we can share, but
Yeah.
still maintain those safety concerns?
Yeah. Safety and confidentiality, I think, are both in play as well. When you're pastoring a church and you're a writer, you got to be careful you're not exposing people in the church, right? So they're afraid to come to you and talk to you because they might end up the subject of an article. And I think security concerns are somewhat similar. I've spoken in areas where there's missionaries present, and I think it's important to be a good writer and a committed writer, to be able to give people what they're looking for as supporters, whether that's prayer, financial, or whatever. But certainly, being aware of those security concerns is awfully important. So I think what I've seen some people do well is just change names and details. There's this category in writing where I think there's what's true and there's what's true enough. And I think it's okay to say what's true enough, which means you might be blending several stories. You might be combining 2 or 3 characters into one thing and sending up updates in that realm. So you're not telling people exactly what's going on in a way that would imperil an individual or something. I was working with a pregnancy care center, and they would say, woman A is, or we have one woman who came in this week, and we want you to pray for this, and another woman. And I suggested, why don't you give them names, just create names for them, but then you can keep coming back to that same person, and you've assigned a name to them. There's a blogger I read who's working in, I think he's in northern Iraq, and that's what he does. He just assigns names to people. There's always a little asterisk that said made up names. That way he can talk about situations, and we can track with characters in his world, but we don't actually know who they are. And he sort of hybridizes the people. So that one individual is sort of a mashup of 2 or 3. So I don't know if there's any value in those, but that's what I've seen be effective there. Yeah. Yeah.
How much research do you do before writing? Do you do like a ton of research and then begin to write, or is it more like you start writing and start to dive in as your brain tracks with that stuff?
Yeah. I think it depends what I'm doing. I don't write academically. And so not a not a lot of my writing requires a whole lot of research. But yeah, when I'm preaching, when I'm, writing a sermon or writing something that does require a little more, there's definitely a synergy there where I'm writing and then, gaining the facts and writing it and then rewriting and adding more facts and so on. So if I have a good idea that I want to write, I'll never not write it down right then. Thinking you'll remember something later, you're almost guaranteed you're going to forget it. So just write it down while you think of it, and then you can always come back and change it. But yeah, I think writing as I go is more the way my mind works. But I don't know if I was writing more on an academic level, I might be doing a whole lot more upfront research before writing. But again, I have a really poor memory, so I can't remember very much, and that's why I think I put little bits into my mind and write them out, and then put more little bits in and write them out, rather than just, take in, completely forget, and then have nothing to say. Yeah.
Tim, I read you in different times you talked about you don't know what you think about something until you write it.
Yeah.
You write about it. How frequent is that where you will maybe try to address a subject or an issue that you sit down to write that
Yeah.
and like you don't know what you think? Like how common is that? Or is it I got a pretty good idea but here's where I'm going, and like how frequent is it that you will maybe discover what you think or change your mind on what you think as you write?
Yeah, it happens a lot. And often I'm just trying to see how many article fragments I have in my hundreds of things I thought I wanted to think about, and I started and I realized I had nothing to say, no insights, nothing. And that's okay too. Maybe you set those things aside or you just obliterate them. But yeah, it's very common that maybe I just have one little idea or one little illustration, and so I just start writing to see what happens. And some of those will end up in a sermon, some of those will end up in, a book or an article. But it might be an idea, it might just be a picture, it might be, I want people to feel this kind of feeling. And so how can I get people to feel that? How can I get them to feel the joy of the resurrection, right? And so that might be where you start. Okay, now how can I bring truth and beauty into play to get people to read what's true, but then also just evoke some beauty, get them to feel that as well. So yeah, it happens a lot where I don't really know what I'm going to say until I'm well into it. And then about half the time, I have to get rid of it because there's really nothing there. It's not worth sharing. Yeah. We've got about two more questions worth, or one more question's worth of time, I believe. Yeah.
How do you collect your writing pieces? So sometimes I'll journal, which I love to do.
Yeah.
And then some will be like poetry pieces that I'll like print out and I'll have them in a folder. So like
Yep.
I kind of have the writing like scattered. Like how do you
Yeah.
organize? Because I don't have like one platform. So
Right. Your own writing, you mean? Your own fragments of writing? Yeah. So I just keep all mine in that one app, Ulysses. That's my exclusive writing app. So everything goes in there. I can write books in there. I can write articles in there. I can write sermons in there. And so if I want to look for something, I can just do search, and it'll search all those fragments of writing. That's my solution. I think there's lots of different ways of doing it, but that's what I use. And it's been reasonably effective. But often I set things aside, and when I go back to them, I realize I don't like them as much as I thought I would, or the idea wasn't as profound as I thought, and all of that. So often it's better just to start over, I find. So. All right, one more question? Yeah.
what's been your journey with like fear of man?
Journey with fear of man, yeah. Well,
That's a light question for
yeah. I got off Twitter, if that answers. Yeah, when you put your writing public, you will get feedback, and some of it will be quite devastating. Okay, true story. I don't think I've ever told this one before. I released a book to the public. The first email I got in, day of release, somebody wrote me and said, "This is the worst book I've ever read. Not only that, this book is so bad, I think the thing for you to do with integrity would be to get in touch with your publisher, have all copies removed from circulation, and refund everybody who pre-ordered the book. I kid you not. This was launch day. Turns out other people didn't feel that way, but boy, did that take the wind out of my sails. Yeah, so you're going to get critical feedback, and I think you got to find that right attitude of who am I really listening to? You know, I've got a few trusted voices in my life who know me, who know who I am, who know what I believe, who know what I'm trying to accomplish. Their voice counts for so much more than the public. So, you know, if you write a book and it goes on Amazon and it gets 1,000 reviews and they're all 1-star reviews, probably you can say it's not a very good book. But more commonly, you're putting ideas out there and you're getting that critical feedback. And a lot of those people are getting into your motives or into who you are as a person or your character. That's where I think you can just set those things aside and say, I trust my wife, I trust my friends, I got a few people, they know who I am, I bear my heart before them, and I'm going to listen to them. And yeah, but fear of man is very prominent among writers, and understandably so, I think, especially in a social media world where people don't have to think, they can just respond very quickly and very ferociously. It's a good thing for writers to work on. Thanks, everyone. I'll stick around for a little bit if you are introverted and were afraid to raise your hand. All right.